Do not move your hands. Officer Mark Dalton's command cut through the rain before Colonel Angela Brooks had even lowered her window completely. Two patrol officers stood beyond her windshield, their weapons raised beneath flashing red and blue lights, while her hands remained locked around the top of the steering wheel. She had done everything correctly. She had slowed down, signaled, pulled onto the shoulder, turned off the engine, and switched on the interior light. None of it seemed to matter. Rain struck the roof of her black sedan like impatient fingers. Angela kept her breathing steady as Dalton approached from the driver's side, his flashlight sweeping across her face, the passenger seat, and the clear garment bag hanging behind her. Inside it rested a dark blue army uniform with silver eagles fixed to the shoulders, but Dalton never looked long enough to understand what he was seeing. His attention remained on Angela. Officer Luke Harris stood several feet behind him, younger, quieter, and visibly uncertain. His weapon was raised, but his eyes moved between Angela's open hands and Dalton's rigid posture. Something about the stop had already begun to trouble him. The report had mentioned a black sedan connected to a nearby theft, but the license plate matched only 3 characters, and the vehicle description was several years off. Dalton had dismissed those differences. Close enough to investigate, he had said. Now Angela sat beneath the cold interior light, dressed in a plain charcoal coat, looking like an ordinary traveler caught on the wrong road at the wrong hour. Dalton ordered her to show identification. My wallet is inside the left side of my coat, Angela said clearly. Tell me exactly how you want me to reach for it. Dalton's flashlight remained fixed on her eyes. Slowly, he said. Do not make any sudden movements. Angela nodded once. I will move my left hand from the steering wheel toward my coat. Before her fingers moved an inch, Dalton's voice rose again. Keep your hands where I can see them. Angela stopped immediately. The bridge seemed to narrow around them. Water streamed along the windshield, turning the patrol lights into trembling bands of color. Cars passed in the far lane, slowing just enough for strangers to glance at the scene before continuing into the darkness. Harris shifted his weight. He remembered an instructor at the academy saying that confusion was not a threat. It was a reason to slow down. Dalton believed the opposite. Earlier that night, he had told Harris that hesitation was how officers lost control. Angela looked from one man to the other. She recognized fear in both of them, but it wore different faces. Dalton's fear had become certainty. Harris's fear had become silence. My identification is inside my coat, she repeated. Tell me which command you want me to follow. Dalton stepped closer. Stop arguing and do what I said. Angela's jaw tightened, but her voice stayed level. You told me to retrieve my identification, and you told me not to move my hands. Those instructions cannot both be followed. Harris lowered his weapon by a fraction. Dalton noticed. Hold your position, he snapped. Angela turned her eyes toward the small red light blinking on Dalton's body camera. It was recording every word, every pause, and every contradictory order. She had spent more than 2 decades making decisions under pressure, guiding frightened people through confusion without allowing panic to become command. Yet nothing about her posture, discipline, or calm seemed visible to the officer standing beside her window. He saw only what he had expected to see before she ever spoke. Angela slowly lifted her chin. Then your command gives me no safe choice, she said. Harris looked at Dalton, waiting for him to recognize the truth in her words. Dalton did not. Instead, his hand tightened, his expression hardened, and the rain fell harder between them. Angela held his gaze through the glass, unaware that within minutes, the uniform hanging behind her would change how both officers saw her, but not the truth of how they had treated her before they knew who she was. 4 hours earlier, Angela Brooks had left Fort Belvoir beneath a gray Virginia sky, carrying one small suitcase, a garment bag, and a promise she had made years ago. She would be present when her son Ethan raised his right hand and took the oath that would begin his own military career. No staff car waited for her. She had refused one. No driver stood beside the curb. She wanted the evening to feel ordinary, not ceremonial, and she wanted Ethan to see his mother arrive without an entourage or a rank announcing her before she entered the room. Her father's black sedan sat in the parking lot beneath a thin layer of rain. The car was nearly 15 years old, its paint faded along the trunk and one rear light occasionally flickering, but Angela had kept it for reasons no mechanic could understand. It still carried the faint scent of cedar from the wooden box her father once stored beneath the passenger seat. Inside that box was an old silver wristwatch he had worn through 30 years of factory shifts, Sunday services, and every school event Angela could remember. He had never served in the military, but he had taught her the kind of discipline no uniform could provide. Never let people decide your worth before you speak, he used to say. And never let anger choose your next step. Angela placed the box in the center console and hung her dress uniform behind the driver's seat. The silver eagle insignia on each shoulder caught the parking lot light before disappearing beneath the clear cover. She changed out of her duty clothes before leaving the base, choosing a dark blouse, charcoal coat, and comfortable shoes for the drive. For the first time in weeks, she looked less like a colonel and more like the mother Ethan remembered from early mornings, burned pancakes, and school parking lots. Her phone rang as she started the engine. Ethan answered before the second tone. "You are really coming," he said. Angela smiled. "I said I would." He was quiet for a moment. "I saved you a seat in the front row." "Then I will be in the front row." She could hear other cadets talking behind him, their voices bright with nervous excitement. Ethan lowered his voice. "Are you bringing Grandpa's watch?" Angela glanced at the wooden box. "I am." He let out a breath that sounded like relief. Years earlier, when Ethan was 12, he had written her a letter during her deployment. "I want to be brave like you," he had written in careful block letters. Angela still carried that letter inside her wallet, folded along the same lines until the paper had softened. She had never told him that courage rarely felt brave from the inside. Most of the time, it felt like fear held quietly enough to make room for judgment. The highway toward Richmond stretched nearly 50 miles through light rain and evening traffic. Angela drove steadily, keeping below the speed limit as the sky darkened. She passed farms, closed gas stations, and long lines of trees bending beneath the wind. Her phone lit up twice with messages from the base, but she ignored them. Tonight belonged to Ethan. At a roadside diner, she stopped for coffee and checked the sedan's rear lights. One glowed steadily. The other flickered once, then returned. She made a note to replace it after the ceremony. Inside the diner, a television reported a theft from an electronics store several counties away. Grainy security footage showed a dark sedan leaving the parking lot, but Angela barely noticed. She paid for her coffee, thanked the cashier, and returned to the road. Less than an hour later, red and blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror. Angela checked her speed, signaled, and pulled onto the widest shoulder near the bridge. She turned off the engine, lowered the window halfway, switched on the interior light, and placed both hands where they could be seen. She had no reason to believe the stop would become anything more than a warning about an unreliable rear light. That belief remained with her until she saw two officers step from the patrol car with their weapons already raised. Officer Mark Dalton had been driving the night shift for 16 years, long enough to mistake familiarity for certainty. Rain swept across the patrol car windshield as he followed Angela's sedan toward the bridge, one hand on the steering wheel and the other near the radio. Beside him, Officer Luke Harris studied the vehicle information glowing on the dashboard screen. Harris was 27, less than a year out of the academy, and still careful enough to read every line before acting. The reported vehicle was a newer black sedan with damage near the rear bumper. Angela's car was older, its bumper intact, and only 3 characters of the license plate matched the alert. Harris pointed at the differences. "This might not be the same car," he said. Dalton kept his eyes on the road. "Close enough to investigate." The answer came quickly, as if speed made it true. Earlier that evening, they had sat in a roadside diner beneath yellow ceiling lights while rain gathered against the windows. Dalton had spoken over a cooling cup of coffee, telling Harris that the streets punished hesitation. "Out there, hesitation gets people hurt," he had said. Harris had nodded because Dalton was his training officer, but another sentence had remained in his mind from the academy. "Confusion is not a threat. It is a reason to slow down." Now those two lessons sat between them as the patrol lights reflected from the wet highway. Angela signaled immediately and pulled onto the widest section of the shoulder. She turned off the engine, lowered her window halfway, switched on the interior light, and placed both hands at the top of the steering wheel. Harris noticed each action. "Safe pullover," he said. Dalton did not answer. He studied the dark sedan, the lone driver, and the covered uniform hanging in the back seat. He could have checked the full plate before leaving the patrol car. He could have requested confirmation from dispatch. Instead, he reached for the door handle. Harris looked again at the alert. The model year was wrong. The partial plate was weak. No witness had described the driver. Still, Dalton stepped into the rain with his weapon drawn, and Harris followed because following felt safer than questioning him. The bridge wind pressed cold water against their uniforms. Dalton moved toward the driver's side while Harris remained several feet behind, trying to keep Angela's hands in view. They had not moved. Her posture was upright, her fingers open, her face calm beneath the interior light. Dalton ordered her not to move. Then he demanded identification. Angela explained that her wallet was inside the left side of her coat and asked how he wanted her to retrieve it. Harris heard clarity in her voice. Dalton heard resistance. "Slowly," Dalton said. Angela announced her movement before beginning it. Dalton immediately ordered her hands back into view. She stopped. Harris felt the contradiction tighten the scene. He lowered his weapon slightly, but Dalton glanced back with a warning in his eyes. "Hold your position." Harris obeyed. Angela looked from one officer to the other, reading them with an unsettling precision. Dalton's fear had become authority. Harris's fear had become obedience. Neither man knew that she had spent decades training people to recognize exactly this kind of moment, when pressure narrowed judgment and rank discouraged correction. Dalton stepped closer to the window and asked where she was coming from. "Fort Belvoir," Angela answered. "What were you doing there?" "I work there." Dalton looked at her old sedan, her plain coat, and the rain-dark highway behind her. His expression said he did not believe her. Harris noticed that too. He also noticed how quickly Dalton had filled every missing fact with suspicion. The radio crackled with an update from dispatch, but the words dissolved beneath the storm. Harris reached toward his shoulder microphone, ready to ask them to repeat it. Dalton raised one hand and silenced him. Angela's gaze shifted toward the blinking red light on Dalton's body camera. Everything was being recorded. The mismatched vehicle. The visible hands. The conflicting commands. The moment Harris understood that something was wrong and chose not to say it. Dalton ordered Angela to step out while keeping both hands on the steering wheel. She did not move. "Officer," she said calmly, "I cannot leave the vehicle and keep my hands where they are." Harris looked at Dalton, waiting for him to correct the command. Dalton only moved closer. In that instant, Harris realized the greatest danger on the bridge was not uncertainty. It was a man who believed admitting uncertainty would make him weak. Angela kept her hands fixed on the steering wheel and studied Dalton through the rain-streaked glass. The name on his badge caught the patrol lights for half a second, and recognition moved quietly through her. Mark Dalton. 3 years earlier, he had sat in the back row of a joint crisis management seminar at Fort Belvoir while Angela taught police officers and military personnel how fear could distort judgment. He had leaned back with his arms crossed, listening only when he wanted something to challenge. During the final session, he had asked whether too much caution could make an officer vulnerable. Angela remembered her answer exactly. Authority is strongest when it can survive a question. Dalton had smiled without warmth and written something in the margin of his notes. Now he stood outside her car with the same guarded expression, but he showed no sign that he remembered her. Without the dark blue uniform, without the silver eagles, and without a room waiting for her to speak, she was simply a black woman in an older sedan on a wet Virginia bridge. Angela understood the danger in correcting a man who believed control depended on never appearing uncertain. She also understood that silence could turn confusion into consequence. "Officer Dalton," she said, "I am willing to step out, but I cannot do that while keeping both hands on the steering wheel. Please give me one clear instruction." Dalton's flashlight remained fixed on her face. "Stop trying to control the stop. I am trying to follow it safely." The answer was calm, but it exposed the contradiction too clearly. Harris shifted behind him. "Sir, the plate does not fully match," he said. Dalton turned his head slightly. "Hold your position." Harris stopped, yet his expression changed. Angela saw the conflict in him. He was not afraid of her. He was afraid of challenging the men responsible for evaluating him. She had seen that fear in young officers before, the fear of being called weak, disloyal, or unprepared. It could be as powerful as any direct order. The radio crackled again. This time the dispatcher's voice came through clearly. Updated description. Suspect vehicle has a damaged rear bumper and a Virginia plate ending in 419. Angela's car had no damaged bumper, and her plate ended in 762. Harris looked at Dalton. "That is not this vehicle," he said. Dalton's shoulders tightened. "We are already here. We finished the stop." Angela heard the sentence and understood what it meant. Facts had changed, but Dalton's pride had not. She slowly turned her head toward Harris. "Officer, you heard the update." Dalton stepped closer to the window. "Do not speak to him." Angela looked back at him. Fear does not become evidence because you speak louder. For the first time, something flickered in Dalton's eyes. Not recognition of her face, but recognition of the words. She had used nearly the same sentence in that classroom 3 years earlier. Harris noticed his reaction. So did Angela. The rain struck harder against the roof, filling the silence between them. Dalton ordered her to open the door. Angela asked permission to move her right hand toward the handle. He told her to do it slowly. She moved only after he confirmed. The door opened a few inches before the wind pushed it wider. Angela stepped onto the wet pavement with both hands raised and visible. Her charcoal coat pulled tight across her shoulders. Behind her, the garment bag shifted, revealing the dark blue uniform and one silver eagle beneath the clear plastic. Harris saw it. Dalton did not. He ordered Angela to face the car. She complied, placing her palms against the roof. The cold metal pressed through her skin. Inside the vehicle, her father's wooden box rested beside the center console, and Ethan's folded letter remained in her wallet. She thought of the promise she had made to be in the front row. She thought of the lesson she had taught Dalton and the fact that he had remembered the challenge but forgotten the responsibility. Harris lowered his weapon another inch. Dalton noticed and spoke without looking back. "Officer Harris, maintain your position." Harris did not raise it again. Angela turned her face just enough to see him. His eyes met hers. In that brief exchange, she understood that he had finally reached the moment every uniform eventually demanded, the moment when obedience and duty stopped meaning the same thing. Dalton ordered Angela to remove her wallet, but he did not change his stance or lower his weapon. The rain ran from the edge of his cap and gathered along his jaw, yet his voice remained hard. "Left hand only," he said. "Move slowly." Angela kept both palms against the roof of the sedan. "My wallet is inside the left side of my coat," she replied. "I will need to move that hand away from the vehicle." Dalton's expression tightened. "Do not make this difficult." Angela looked toward the red light blinking on his body camera. "I am describing the movement before I make it. That is not making it difficult. That is making it clear." Harris stood several feet behind Dalton, his weapon now angled toward the pavement. He had heard the corrected vehicle description. He had seen the intact bumper and the plate ending in 762. Every fact told him the stop should have slowed down. Dalton's pride kept pushing it forward. "Sir," Harris said, "dispatch already cleared this vehicle description." Dalton did not turn. "We still verify identification." Angela felt the cold metal beneath her right palm and the rain soaking through the shoulders of her coat. She thought of Ethan waiting for morning, of the front row seat he had saved, and of the letter folded inside the wallet Dalton now demanded. She could not allow frustration to choose her next movement. Slowly, she lifted her left hand from the roof. Harris watched her fingers remain open. She moved toward the coat pocket 1 inch at a time. Dalton raised his voice. "Keep that hand visible." Angela stopped. "It is visible." "Continue," he said. She moved again. The leather edge of the wallet appeared. Dalton shifted his feet, reading the smallest motion as resistance. Harris saw the pattern clearly now. Angela was not creating danger. Dalton was interpreting compliance through suspicion. She removed the wallet and held it between 2 fingers. Where do you want me to place it? On the ground. Angela bent only after he confirmed the instruction. She lowered the wallet onto the wet pavement and stepped back as directed. A gust of wind swept beneath the open cover and flipped it wide. Her Virginia driver's license appeared first. Beneath it rested a Department of Defense identification card. Harris moved closer without realizing it. The Army affiliation was visible, along with the pay grade 06. He looked through the open rear door at the garment bag hanging behind the seat. The dark blue uniform had shifted beneath the clear plastic, revealing the silver eagle insignia on one shoulder. Harris's eyes widened. Dalton followed his gaze. For the first time that night, the certainty left his face. He bent toward the wallet and read the name again. Angela Brooks. The photograph matched the woman standing beside the sedan. The pay grade did not mean anything to him at first. Harris spoke before Dalton could ask. 06 is Colonel. The words seemed to change the temperature of the bridge. Dalton looked at Angela, then at the uniform, then back at the identification card. His posture loosened, but no apology followed. Instead, he asked why she had not told them earlier. Angela held his gaze. You did not ask who I was. You decided who I was. Dalton's mouth opened, but nothing came. Harris stared at the body camera on Dalton's chest, aware that every order and every contradiction had been recorded. Angela looked at him next. Her voice softened, though the authority inside it did not. You already know what happened here, Officer Harris. The question is whether you will say it. The radio hissed in the silence. Dalton reached for his microphone and reported that the driver had been identified and the scene was under control. Angela listened carefully. He did not mention the mismatched vehicle. He did not mention the conflicting commands. He did not mention the moment Harris tried to correct him. Dalton closed the wallet and held it out to her, as if returning it could return the night to normal. Angela did not take it. Place it on the hood, she said. Dalton hesitated, then obeyed. Harris watched that small reversal of movement and understood that rank had changed Dalton's behavior in seconds. The truth, however, had not changed at all. The rain eased into a steady whisper as Angela stood beside the sedan, watching Harris absorb the meaning of her words. Dalton placed the wallet on the hood as instructed, but his movements had changed. The sharp certainty was gone. In its place was a careful stiffness, the kind people adopted when they suddenly understood that someone else might review every choice they had made. Harris lowered his weapon completely and secured it. The motion was quiet, but Angela noticed. So did Dalton. Why are you lowering your weapon? Dalton asked. Because there is no threat, Harris replied. His voice trembled slightly, yet he did not raise it again. Dalton glanced toward the patrol car, then toward the body camera on his chest. Rainwater slid across the small red light, but it continued blinking. Angela looked at the younger officer. The bridge no longer felt loud. The passing traffic, the radio, and the wind seemed to pull away until only the three of them remained beneath the cold wash of emergency lights. Harris stepped closer to the sedan and examined the plate. 762. He repeated the numbers into his shoulder microphone and asked dispatch to confirm the update. The response came immediately. The suspected vehicle ended in 419 and had visible damage to the rear bumper. Angela's sedan had neither. Harris closed his eyes for half a second, then opened them. He looked at Dalton, waiting for an acknowledgement that did not come. Instead, Dalton said they had acted on the information available at the time. Angela heard the familiar defense. It appeared in offices, hearings, and command reviews whenever someone wanted circumstances to carry responsibility for a decision. She lifted the wallet from the hood and checked the contents. Her father's folded note remained tucked behind her driver's license. Ethan's letter was still there, softened at the edges from years of being carried. Nothing had been taken, yet the moment had already cost something. Harris looked through the open car door at the garment bag. The silver eagle insignia rested beneath the clear plastic, bright whenever the patrol lights crossed it. He seemed embarrassed by how quickly that symbol had changed the atmosphere. Angela closed the wallet. The lesson is not that you should have recognized my rank, she said. Harris met her eyes. The lesson is that you should not have needed it. Dalton shifted uncomfortably. "Colonel," he began, but Angela stopped him with a calm look. "You did not call me that 5 minutes ago." The words were not cruel. That made them heavier. Harris looked down at the wet pavement. Angela could see the question forming inside him. What happens now? Before he could ask, Dalton moved toward the patrol car and began speaking quietly into the radio. His tone was controlled, but he omitted the corrected vehicle description and described the stop as a routine verification. Harris listened. Angela listened. The silence between them became another command, one that asked the younger officer to agree without being told directly. Harris stared at Dalton's back, then at the camera on his own chest. His recording light was active too. Angela stepped closer, keeping her voice low. "You already know what happened here. The question is whether you will say it." Harris swallowed. He looked toward Dalton, then back at her. The fear in his face was no longer about the bridge. It was about the station, the reports, and the cost of contradicting a senior officer. Angela recognized that fear because she had seen it in young soldiers who knew an order was wrong but were unsure whether their careers could survive the truth. She softened her tone. "Courage is not always standing in front of danger, Officer Harris. Sometimes it is refusing to stand behind a lie." Dalton ended the radio call and turned toward them. "Everything all right?" he asked. Harris looked at Angela one final time. Then he reached for his microphone. "Dispatch," he said, "I need a supervisor at our location." This stop involved a vehicle mismatch and conflicting commands. Dalton's face hardened. Harris continued before he could interrupt. "I also need both body camera recordings preserved." The bridge fell silent again. Angela drew one slow breath. For the first time that night, the truth had been spoken before permission was given. Captain Rebecca Moore arrived 12 minutes later, her unmarked vehicle stopping behind the patrol car as the rain faded to a thin mist. She stepped onto the bridge wearing a dark waterproof coat over her uniform, her expression calm and unreadable. Dalton moved toward her first, speaking quickly about a suspicious vehicle, incomplete information, and a driver who had questioned instructions. Moore listened without interrupting. Then she turned to Harris. He stood beside the sedan with his hands visible and his body camera still recording. "Captain, the vehicle did not match the updated description," he said. "The rear bumper was intact, the license plate was different, and the driver complied throughout the stop." Dalton looked at him sharply. Harris continued. The commands became contradictory. "I should have spoken sooner." Moore shifted her attention to Angela, who stood near the open driver's door holding her wallet against her rain-darkened coat. "Are you injured, ma'am?" "No," Angela replied. "I am cold, late, and deeply concerned about what was allowed to happen here." Moore nodded once. "May I see your identification?" Angela handed it to her. Moore studied the Department of Defense card, the Army affiliation, and the pay grade. Her eyes moved toward the garment bag inside the car, where the Silver Eagle insignia remained visible beneath the clear cover. "Colonel Brooks," she said, returning the card. Dalton lowered his gaze. Angela noticed the title enter the conversation only after the uniform and rank had become impossible to ignore. Moore requested the dispatch recording, the original vehicle alert, and both body camera files. She instructed Dalton to return to the patrol car and make no further radio report until an independent supervisor reviewed the stop. Dalton opened his mouth to object, but Moore's expression stopped him. Harris remained on the shoulder beside Angela. His face showed relief, but not pride. He understood that telling the truth after remaining silent did not erase the silence. Moore asked Angela whether she recognized Dalton. 3 years ago, Angela said, he attended a crisis management seminar I taught at Fort Belvoir. Moore looked toward the patrol car. Dalton heard the answer through the open door and went still. At the station, less than an hour later, investigators searched the county training archive. They found the recording beneath an old program title and loaded it beside the bridge footage. On one screen, Angela stood before a classroom in her dark blue uniform, Silver Eagles bright beneath fluorescent lights. Dalton sat in the back row with his arms crossed. On the second screen, the same man stood beside her sedan in the rain, giving commands that could not be followed together. The archived Angela spoke with calm precision. When authority feels threatened by questions, mistakes become policy. In the classroom recording, Dalton leaned toward another officer and smiled as if the warning belonged to someone else. Captain Moore watched both screens without speaking. Harris sat at the far end of the conference table, his written statement unfinished before him. Dalton stood near the door, no longer offering explanations. The bridge recording showed Angela announcing every movement. It captured Harris mentioning the mismatched vehicle. It recorded the dispatch update clearly. It also recorded Dalton choosing to continue after the facts had changed. Moore paused the footage on Angela's face. She was standing in the rain with her hands visible, looking directly toward the body camera. Dalton stared at the frozen image and finally recognized her, not from the identification card, but from the classroom he had dismissed. "You remembered the argument," Angela said later when Moore called her from the station. "You simply forgot the responsibility." Moore placed Dalton on administrative leave pending an independent review. Harris submitted a separate statement and accepted that his own delay would be examined as well. Before sunrise, the two recordings were formally preserved, and the original report was flagged for correction. Angela returned to her sedan and resumed the drive toward Richmond. On the passenger seat, her father's wooden box waited beside a cooling cup of coffee. The front row ceremony was only hours away. Behind her, in a silent conference room, Dalton watched the old lesson begin again, knowing that this time he could not pretend it was meant for someone else. Angela reached Richmond just before dawn, the sky beginning to pale behind the low clouds. She parked outside the military hall and remained in the car for a moment, listening to the engine settle into silence. The bridge felt far away, yet its cold still clung to her coat. On the passenger seat, her father's wooden box rested beside the garment bag, and Ethan's old letter remained folded. Inside her wallet. She looked at the line he had written years earlier. "I want to be brave like you." Angela closed her eyes briefly. Courage had never meant appearing untouched. It meant carrying the truth forward without allowing anger to become the only thing left. Inside the building, Ethan stood near the front of the hall in a newly pressed uniform, checking the entrance every few seconds. When Angela appeared, his shoulders dropped with visible relief. She had changed into her dark blue dress uniform, the silver eagles resting on her shoulders beneath the soft morning light. Ethan walked toward her, then stopped when he noticed the damp edge of her coat and the exhaustion in her face. "What happened?" he asked. Angela looked at the rows of waiting cadets and families. "A mistake was made," she said. "And someone decided not to hide it." Ethan studied her expression but did not press. She handed him the wooden box. Inside was his grandfather's silver watch, its face worn but carefully polished. He held it as though it carried more weight than metal. "Grandpa wore this every day," Angela said. "He believed time reveals what people try to conceal." Ethan closed the box and nodded. Across town, Captain Moore began the formal review. Dalton was removed from street duty, and an outside investigator was assigned to examine the stop. Harris gave a complete statement, including the moment he recognized the vehicle mismatch and chose not to challenge Dalton immediately. He did not ask for protection from the consequences. That mattered to Moore. During the following weeks, the recordings were reviewed by department leadership, legal counsel, and an independent civilian board. The evidence was clear. Dalton had continued the stop after dispatch corrected the description, issued instructions that could not safely be followed together, and allowed suspicion to replace verification. Harris had failed to intervene soon enough, but his separate report preserved the truth before the official narrative could harden. Angela was invited to submit a statement. She refused to ask for revenge. Instead, she requested 3 changes. Officers would be required to pause and verify when vehicle descriptions did not match. Training officers could no longer punish junior officers for requesting clarification during high-pressure stops. Most importantly, every officer would be required to intervene when commands became contradictory or unnecessarily escalated. Dalton later asked to send Angela a letter through his attorney. She agreed to read it but made no promise to respond. In the letter, he wrote that he had not known she was a colonel. Angela set the page down after that sentence. When she finally replied, her message contained only 2 lines. "You should not have needed to know my rank. You needed only to recognize my humanity." Harris received a suspension and mandatory retraining. When he returned, he volunteered to speak during academy sessions about the cost of silence. He never called himself courageous. He began each session by telling recruits that he had recognized the problem before he acted, and that delay had nearly allowed fear to write the truth for everyone. Months later, Angela sat in Captain Moore's office reviewing the new policy language. Moore asked whether the changes felt like justice. Angela looked through the window at officers entering the training center below. "Justice is not a feeling," she said. "It is what remains after the attention moves on." Moore nodded and signed the final page. Outside, Harris waited in the hallway. When Angela passed him, he stood straighter. "I should have spoken sooner," he said. "Yes," she replied. Then she softened. "But you spoke before silence became permanent." Harris lowered his eyes, grateful but not absolved. Angela continued toward the exit, her father's watch now resting on Ethan's wrist and the old letter still inside her wallet. The story was no longer only about what had happened on the bridge. It was about what people chose to build after the fear had passed. 6 months later, the new training policy took effect across the county, not with a press conference or a row of cameras, but inside a quiet classroom where 20 recruits sat beneath fluorescent lights and watched the bridge footage from beginning to end. No one spoke when the recording stopped. On the screen, Angela stood beside the sedan with her hands visible, while 2 officers struggled to decide whether fear or evidence would guide them. Harris stood at the front of the room in a plain training uniform, his badge resting on the table instead of his chest. He did not introduce himself as the officer who told the truth. He introduced himself as the officer who waited too long. Then he described the moment when he understood the vehicle did not match, the moment when the commands became impossible to follow, and the moment when silence began to feel like participation. Across the room, several recruits lowered their eyes. Others looked directly at him. Harris did not soften the lesson. "Authority does not excuse confusion," he said. "It makes clarity more important." That same morning, Angela entered the military hall where Ethan's final commissioning ceremony was about to begin. Sunlight poured through the tall windows and stretched across the polished floor in warm, quiet bands. She wore her dark blue dress uniform, the silver eagles bright against her shoulders, but she carried herself without ceremony. Ethan stood at the front with the other new officers, his grandfather's silver watch secured around his wrist. When he saw his mother take her seat in the first row, his expression changed from formal concentration to something softer. She had kept her promise. Captain Moore sat several chairs away, invited not as a public official, but as someone who had chosen to make the truth useful. Dalton was not present. The independent review had ended his field career, and the state had revoked his law enforcement certification after finding that he had ignored corrected information and failed to de-escalate the stop. Angela had read the final report once. She did not keep a copy on her desk. Accountability had been necessary, but she refused to let his failure occupy more space in her life than the lesson required. The oath began. Ethan raised his right hand and repeated each word clearly, promising to serve with integrity and defend the Constitution. Angela listened closely. She had heard those words many times, but that morning they carried a different weight. Service was not proven by the uniform a person wore. It was proven in the moment when power could be used carelessly and someone chose restraint instead. When the oath ended, Ethan stepped forward and looked directly at his mother. He raised his hand in a formal salute. Angela stood and returned it. The room remained silent for several seconds, not from uncertainty, but from understanding. The silver watch caught the sunlight between them. In that quiet, Angela thought of her father, the bridge, Harris's trembling voice, and the sentence she had written to Dalton. "You needed only to recognize my humanity." Later, outside beneath an oak tree, Ethan asked whether she believed the system had truly changed. Angela watched families gather on the lawn while young officers posed for photographs. "Systems do not change once," she said. "People have to choose the change every day." Harris arrived near the edge of the courtyard after finishing the academy session. He did not interrupt. Angela noticed him and gave a small nod. He returned it, carrying neither pride nor shame, only responsibility. Ethan looked between them. "Is that forgiveness?" he asked. Angela considered the question. "Forgiveness does not erase accountability," she said. "It means refusing to become what hurt you." A breeze moved through the leaves overhead. The flags above the hall lifted and settled. Angela placed one hand on Ethan's shoulder, then looked toward the road beyond the gates, where ordinary cars passed without anyone knowing the history carried inside them. The lesson had never been that she deserved dignity because she was a colonel. The lesson was that dignity should have been present before anyone saw her rank. And if you had stood on that bridge beside Harris, knowing the truth but fearing the cost of speaking, would you have remained silent, or would you have found the courage to say what you saw?